Vietnam War changed history to this day. This 20-year war occurred from 1955 to 1975, was fought to prevent the spread of communism. The Americans in the war tragically lost many soldiers, and North Vietnam triumphed in the spread of communism. The participants in this war were the USA, North Vietnam, and South Vietnam. The Vietnam War had many personal and historical influences on the Americans and world history.
The Vietnam War was a conflict between North and South Vietnam that lasted over 20 years. It pitted the communist government of North Vietnam against South Vietnam and its main partner, the USA. The Vietnam War is the common name for the Second Indochina War from 1954 to 1975. In the end, it was a communist victory in April 1975. The main fight was over North Vietnam wanting to spread communism over South Vietnam, similar to practices in China and the Soviet Union. South Vietnam did not want communism in their country. The U.S. also wanted to prevent communism. This fear of the spread of communism is called the domino theory. This stated that if one country in Southeast Asia fell into communism, then surrounding countries would also fall to communism. The U.S. joined South Vietnam to help in the war. As a result of this, over 500,000 U.S. military troops would fight in Vietnam. Eventually, the U.S. became overwhelmed in the war and withdrew their forces in 1973, as South Vietnam fell in 1975 and North Vietnam took control. President Kennedy got the U.S. involved in 1961 and sent 400 Special Operation Forces trained soldiers to teach South Vietnam troops how to fight. In November 1963, there were more than 16,000 U.S. military advisors in South Vietnam, and about 100 Americans were killed. In February and March of 1965, President Johnson, after Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, authorized bombing to begin by U.S. aircraft into the north. President Johnson also dispatched 3,500 Marines to South Vietnam. Then it was war. During the war, U.S. planes dropped more than twice as many bombs as their forces had used during World War II. The U.S. military also sprayed millions of gallons of chemical agents that killed the crops on the South Vietnamese land during the war. These chemicals are commonly called Agent Orange. The U.S. military used more than 14 million tons of explosives in the war, and most of the deaths of the war were from bombing. In January 1973, the United States made a peace agreement with North Vietnam. In the end, about 58,000 American soldiers were killed and another 304,000 were wounded in the Vietnam War. The war still continues to affect political and military decisions today.
The weapons used in the Vietnam War were more devastating than those of any previous conflict in history. The United States and South Vietnamese forces relied heavily on their superior air power, including B-52 bombers and other aircrafts that dropped thousands of pounds of explosives on North Vietnam and communist targets in South Vietnam. Infantry weapons on both sides utilized a variety of tools to further their aims, including highly toxic chemicals called Agent Orange that would have devastating long-term effects. The war had devastating impacts on the economy and agriculture and killed over 3 million people with a cost of $173 billion, a true tragedy.
Negative opinions about the Vietnam War were starting, and mass demonstrations started to take place. The first mass demonstration occurred in December 1964, gathering more than 600 people in San Francisco. One of the most notorious protests involved students at Kent State University in Kent, Ohio. The Kent State shooting took place on May 4, 1970. Unarmed college students were injured by the Ohio National Guard during a mass protest against the bombing of Cambodia by the United States military forces. 4 Kent State students were killed and 9 were injured on May 4, 1970. The members of the Ohio State National Guard took fire at the gathered students protesting. The aftermath was horrific for students and their parents. After the shooting, students went on strike and forced the temporary closure of colleges and universities across the country. Good, or do you think I'm bad?
My grandfather, Ronald Hickman, and my great-grandfather, Dave Durham, both served in the Vietnam War. My grandfather, Ronald Hickman, served in the United States Army from 1966 to 1968. He served in the Army as a mechanized recon, and he served in South Vietnam. He suffered many physical injuries during the war. He was shot 3 times, twice in the leg and once in the nerve of his finger. He was shot because his lieutenant didn't believe him that he saw enemies, but he actually did, so that night they ambushed him, and it resulted in him getting shot. He had 3 surgeries and still has some bullet pieces in his leg that they're unable to remove. He was also sprayed with a deadly chemical called Agent Orange. This chemical can be poisonous, but luckily he only got leg rash and hepatitis C. He also got PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, which means he has lots of trouble sleeping and he has flashbacks. So this is why he can't watch war movies anymore, and he received a Purple Heart for his service. My great-grandfather, Dave Durham, served in the U.S. Navy during the Vietnam War. He served from 1967 to 1968. His home base was in Saigon, but he was also stationed in Binh Tre and Vung Tau. He served as a tin bender, which means he worked with sheet metal to shape it and help the army. The important lessons he learned from the war were never to trust too many people and be careful who you talk to. His favorite part of the war was that he made it home safely. He told me an experience that he saw many people die, explode, and get shot and injured, but luckily he wasn't physically injured. However, he did get PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which means it has symptoms of trouble sleeping, anxiety, and things like that, so he can't watch war movies because it gives him flashbacks about the war. He also in 2018, he made a documentary with his group from the Army called Scramble the Sea Wolves.